Okay, it hasn't said it, but it is recording now. Apologies, I'll cut that
Okay,
part out.
no problem. No problem. Welcome to the very humbly titled The Most Important Thing podcast.
Yes, and
And we are your hosts, Shashwat and Dylan. And today we have Robby Yung, who actually is living up to his last name. He looks pretty young, he looks pretty fresh.
fresh for
And he's
2023.
here to talk with us. And he's yeah, and he's here to talk with us today, and we're so happy to have him. One of the things that I thought might be an interesting and provocative way to start this conversation out was to discuss how you met Yat and how you started working with Animoca. I'm curious
Sure.
about that.
Sure. No problem. So Yat and I have been friends, 25 years. So we
Oh my
met
God.
during the Web 1.0 phase in Hong Kong. And we both had our first startups around the same time. So this is, I want to say 97, 98. And we were trying to convince companies in the world that they needed to get online and build a website and have email and do all those things. And so we met because we were part of a very small startup community in Hong Kong doing different things. At that time, I had a web development business, and Yat had an enterprise messaging business. And so we were part of a community of maybe 20 founders in Hong Kong, and we used to get together every couple of weeks and swap war stories and try to introduce each other to potential investors and just bootstrap like small communities do. And so that's how we met. We've stayed friends ever since. And about little over 10 years ago, I'd sold my last business, which was more of a traditional media business at that time, and was looking for something new. And Yat had just, launched what became Animoca Brands a couple of years earlier as a mobile free-to-play game studio, and was having a great deal of success, actually, in those early days of the Apple App Store back in 2010, 2011. So I joined in 2012 with an eye towards helping to kind of scale that business. And we had a reasonable run of it for a few years, and then we discovered blockchain, and then that reasonable run accelerated dramatically.
Yes, I think you've done well.
Understood. Yeah, I think you've done well too. And I actually know a wrinkle to this story, which is that um, based on what I've talked, I think I talked about it with Yat when we were very briefly when we were doing our pitch meeting for like NFT3. And by the way, audience, not only is Robby Yung a guest, but he's sort of in a proxy, not super way, but proxy way, kind of like a boss because Animoca is one of our lead investors. But you're not with the venture arm, I understand, right?
No,
If
no,
I'm
not with the
correct.
ventures
Kind of
business.
So
boss.
not truly, you're sort of like
Correct.
but but anyway, now I know that the wrinkle
Exactly.
here is that, and it will touch upon probably why you were affirmed in that choice to be really, to be passionate about this area, which is that was it not the case that at some point during your sort of run up on the you having success on the Apple Store that they changed their terms, correct?
Yes,
Is
yes,
that
that's
correct?
correct.
Do I still? So they changed their terms. So it was an example of a centralized entity being able to exert influence over your
Yeah,
ecosystem.
absolutely. Well, what happened was they didn't really even change the terms. I mean, essentially, we just went from a business with a
Mm,
portfolio of games and tens of millions of users producing at that point, a substantial amount of money. I mean, we were producing, let's just say, more than enough revenue to sustain, 150 people in our office. And then essentially, we came into the office one day and everything had disappeared because our app store account had been closed, and that was it.
right,
And all the business
right.
flows through that account, and that's it. That's substantially your entire business. And And the challenge, the frustration with that situation is that, unlike, being a company that gets shut down by a regulatory process or something, there's no court of appeals. There's no, all you can do is send an email to help@apple.com, and that's it.
Mm,
There's no
yeah.
account manager. I mean, at that time, they didn't even have an office in Hong Kong or China. So there's literally, you're sending emails into the ether in Cupertino somewhere. And so the frustrating part is that there's just no way to appeal that process. It's simply done
Mm,
by the whim of somebody at Apple, and was not
hmm.
conducted in a way to say, it's not like, oh, they reach out and say, hey, we noticed something funny with your account. Can we find out what's going on here? Because it looks suspicious or something like that. No, somebody just made a decision based on something without consulting us and literally shut down a multi-million-dollar business overnight. And that part, I think, made us keenly aware of the risks of centralization, because you lose due process, which is something we take for granted in a democratic society.
I have a very interesting story. I,
Yeah,
for
that's
one, by the way, did not know this about the origins of Animoca. It's very endearing, and I can kind of understand now where, and we will get into this later, but where the passion you folks have for sovereignty when it comes to the digital world comes from, But so you guys have heard of Shark Tank, right? This big thing in the States and so on and so forth. And in
Hmm.
India, it's just launched again with its second season last week or something. And as you can imagine, a lot of viewers in India, and it's doing very, very well. And I came across the story of a startup which was called Witty Feed back in the day, and we're doing much like you said, approximately 10 million in revenue yearly. But the central point of failure for them was that all of their traffic was coming from a Facebook page, and these guys had 230
Hmm.
employees. They had, in INR terms, apparently they had 40 crore INR revenue every year, and they were doing remarkably well. They were basically the second biggest blog after BuzzFeed globally in terms of traffic numbers. So you can imagine it's a massive, massive business. And the same thing happened. It just vanished overnight because Facebook deleted their page. No due process, not even a comment, nothing. And this guy
Yep.
came to Shark Tank this time with essentially the phoenix of that project called Stage, and they're
Hmm.
essentially pivoted to something like a Netflix but for regional languages in India. And they've just closed how many? I think a $5 million round for that. This past week they've announced it, and they're doing remarkably well. But I'm, with that story, and now as well as with yours, I was so impressed by that indomitable will that some entrepreneurs have, where it's like, yeah, okay, I'm going to carry forward. And with Animoca, the beautiful thing, us being Web3 folk, is that not only did you keep going, but you found a way to improve that for the rest of the world by taking on this decentralization focus. So that's really, really interesting how you came to that to begin with.
but do you feel, Rob, um, or do you feel that there, or do you have a moral sensibility to what you're doing? And do you feel that there's, do you feel that there's a philosophical or ideological orientation to what you're doing with Animoca?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that this stems, I would say,
Expand on that, because yeah.
yeah, I think this stems less from a decentralization for the sake of decentralization and like radical transparency, freedom, libertarian. I know there are these strains within the Web3 community. I think we try to approach things just on a much more basic level, because, the world is a big, complicated place and we can only change so much about it. I think because we come at things from an entertainment content perspective, we think a lot about the creator economy. And when you look around at centralized content platforms, these have been created over the last decade, 15 years, really as a solution to the problem of the lack of security on the internet. So, because we don't really have a great way to secure digital content, so digital rights management, largely non-existent, we decided that centralized platforms were the best way to do that, because we can't control MP3s, so we'll all have Spotify and we'll subscribe to it and let one party hold all the song files. Um, Now, this is a short term solution, really, in my view, because it was created to solve a technical problem. So, if we can solve the technical problem, then there's no reason that we can't have different business models. And so, our view is that we can create thanks to blockchain and the idea of being able to have true digital ownership on the blockchain, we can actually have digital rights management that's effective and therefore move away from the need for centralized platforms. And when you do that, you can have a much more equitable relationship between creators and the value that they get out of their products, because this control is somewhat decentralized. And so I think the best example I can think of is I remembering seeing something on Twitter a couple of years ago, from Pharrell, and he tweeted his royalty statement from his song "Happy," which was a very big global hit. And he made, like, I don't know, $80,000 or something in royalties from Spotify in a year. And the point of doing that was just to say, look, if that's all Pharrell can make from a song like that,
Yeah.
imagine what everybody else who's putting money on Spotify experiences. So the platform is incredible for users, but it's really not so great for creators. And so it's not sustainable. And we need to figure out a way to create relationships between creators and consumers that's more sustainable for everybody, so everybody benefits in the ecosystem.
Couldn't I couldn't agree more. And apologies, in the days of doing Zoom meetings with at home office, there sometimes are
Cited
wild
and
animals
heard.
that will be going off in the background. um, the wild animal is a small Chorky, about this size, about this big, but I he's got a big bark. So yeah, like I guess like I when you one of the criticisms, not a criticism, but one of the things that I come back to when I think about this, and I think about, because I feel like this narrative has been around for some time, and like of trying to disintermediate or render more dynamic or new business model efficiencies as a result of this sort of P2P orientation to either the internet in general, creator economies, and blah blah blah, or just this general concept of digital property rights. And I I feel like it's almost like the fusion reactor debate. It's like it's imminent, it's coming, but it's always seems to be years away. And I would love to know from your perspective, not necessarily a forecast, but some of the macros, some of the individual psychology, perhaps, that you believe, and some of the application layer challenges or things that you've experienced that are delaying that process, because it seems to be, to me, quite obvious, working in this area, that there are so many benefits that we could experience if this were the case. And I would love to hear from you your perspective on that.
Sure. I think that it's funny. I think we're a victim of our, as an industry, our own ability to kind of draw on the history of the internet and the sort of pace of the growth of applications and new paradigms on the internet, that it's put us in a position now where we can, for those of us who are well embedded in the Web3 community, we feel like we can see the writing on the wall and we understand that this is where the internet is headed, which is why we call it Web3, and that this part seems obvious to us. But in some respects, that's putting the cart before the horse, because we forget just how long it actually takes to develop good software and to battle test it and to test it at scale. And when you think about going back in the history of different types of enterprise software and infrastructure, how many years it actually took to get that stuff right. To think about the fact that you might still use Microsoft Word, which is based on a code base from the 70s, you know, um, and so I think that y-
That's
you forget that that stuff happens in our industry, and so we start to think about instant gratification, and we start to think this stuff can be built overnight. But the reality is, just like in my business where we make games, a good game can take you, like, if you want to do a photorealistic AAA game, it'll take you 2 or 3 years to develop a game. And we just don't have that kind of patience anymore because we expect stuff can happen very quickly. And especially when you're breaking ground with relatively new technologies, stuff is going to break along the way. So you need to keep testing it and iterating and, innovating. And that's what people are doing. And we've seen great examples of that, but not without plenty of hiccups along the way. So I think it's just important to sort of take a reality
mm,
check every once in a while and realize that, wow, NBA Top Shot only came out 3 years ago.
Right.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, and I think as you were talking, I was just thinking about this analogy that a friend and guest of ours had made. His name's Trevor, who co-founded Polymath. Said, like, our focus sometimes on this application layer is almost like we want to put
Right.
furniture in a house that hasn't yet been built.
Yep.
And extending that analogy, is like this idea of, that these technical layers are not really fully mature yet. And part of our mo at NFT3 was we felt that it was extremely important to start talking about the technical layer of decentralized identity as sort of this, having this ability to be like a common referent across, or this sort of proxy for interoperability between different L1s, or between different games, and or between different metaverses, right? And I think that that's an example of how infrastructural key and core infrastructural pieces are still being combined and put together and synergized. Um, and I think that will take some time, and but the focus on what could happen is at that application layer, because we're trying to envision the end game. And so and I think to some extent, we have a hand in getting people exhilarated and excited about that future. But it does have this other side to it of us maybe sometimes getting ahead of ourselves, and being um, our own worst enemy in terms of the expectations, right? So sometimes I feel we need to be careful about
Mhm.
sometimes our messaging, and I wonder, if do you ever have that, do you feel that pressure, or are you erring on the side of saying it's a bright future, or are you really, do you feel like a responsibility to say, hey, wait a second, like, and I'm thinking of like Vlad Zamfir in like 2015. I remember seeing him on like a Bitcoin talk, like, forum post. He's like, Ethereum is actually like terrible software right now, and everyone was like gutted, or actually it's 2016, it was later, and it was like, what? Vlad Zamfir said it's terrible. Wait, I got to get out of this. Good thing none of me and my friends got out of it at that time, but I
I actually
digress.
have a
What are your
further.
thoughts on
I
that?
want to take it to a further direction as well, if that's cool. Because
Oh,
because
sorry,
because I
Shash.
Sure.
felt like Robbie,
Of course.
you remind me a lot of when I spoke to Yat as well. This, and dial in too. This focus on the infra hasn't been built out, and that, while that absolutely makes sense, and kind of NFT is another attempt towards one of those building blocks that we require. Um, this debate of, are we being accelerationists and overtly optimistic, but then on the other side, the idea that with tokens, now NFTs, right, we have, I think, pretty much figured out how to rewire incentivization models. And I'm very, very optimistic about this idea. So the need for creators being pulled finally back out of that long tail system where they're essentially crushed, right? And the ability for the users to become co-creators with them, in a sense, the need is very apparent, I think, even to the masses. I think it's, if I use the phrase product market fit, right, I think it's just an issue of, right now, a, the infra layer not really being robust enough for the masses to be able to buy in. But don't you guys think that on the social engineering side of things, we have this figured out pretty damn well, I think, in terms of how to align entire communities, right from the builders to down to the end consumer, and I think that's why that many DApp attempts have still even gotten made, regardless of how non-robust or incomplete the infra layer is. So don't you think that as soon as we have a little bit of evolution on the infra side, we might see more rapid success than we are anticipating right now? What do you think?
100%, 100%. And actually, I don't want to, I don't want to rain on the infrastructure parade. The infrastructure is pretty decent, and I think we have frankly invented a lot of solutions along the way. Like, look at all of the layer 2 scaling solutions for Ethereum and things like that. So, and guilds and rental protocols and all these things have been kind of invented out of thin air to solve problems that arose with trying to build an industry on top of some nascent software. I think the biggest hurdle to overcome, honestly, is going to be the the laziness of the consumer, right? And this is of course not business 101, because
Yeah.
Yes, yes,
you should not
yes,
be
dude.
insulting your
Yes.
customers. So please, nobody be offended by my calling you lazy.
No, but
But the
it's
problem is that if you think about
I don't take it as
Yeah,
that. It's
I
like their
yeah,
I think I
habits,
absolutely.
would
But
I
it's
I
habits. It's
think
not
though,
laziness
if you
almost.
think about
Does
it,
that, yeah, it's
like
like,
the
yeah.
if you think about like your Apple Pay or your Google Play account, right? These are things that now it's become normal for us to think about being able to make a mobile purchase with one click or two clicks. And we forget that actually, when we had to connect a credit card and open up an account the first time, it was actually dreadful. And this onboarding process from some of the biggest companies on earth was dreadful because it's very hard to do it beautifully. And even 10 years later, the onboarding flow is still not perfect. Um, but once you're on board, they have you because they own everything about you. So the incremental purchase is very simple. And once you get accustomed to that, then it makes it hard to go back and start from scratch somewhere else because you're like, oh my God, I got to fill out all this information. I can't be bothered to do that.
yeah.
Yeah, and this is what makes it so frustrating for me to consider, because it's like, well, you know, it's like, if only like everybody realized, that we could it could be so different, right? And everyone's so used to the way that this is, and it's like, what, and they're so habituated to it. It's like there's almost this kind of like attitude, I think, among people in Web3, where it's sort of like, wait, like, don't you see, like, this could be really,
Hmm.
really different. And then there's also this other side of it on the consumer side. People don't know anything about Web3. Dev never touched a wallet. They would interact with this, and it's like, let me get away from that, because that is confusing, it's difficult, it's hard. And I think it's so insightful, Robbie, like, for you to be like talking about how the false starts and the challenges of these companies when they're first starting out, to even get to a point now where it's still kind of a weird
Yep.
process, but it's somewhat smooth. um and like, yeah, anyway, sorry, I'm just
Yeah, I
affirming what
think,
you're saying here, more or less. But I find I've it's like I'm
I think the right
frustrated
phrase for that
sometimes
is like
thinking about.
captured by convenience, or something of
Hmm.
that vein, and it totally makes
Mm.
sense. I always also think that it's a bit of a uphill battle, because what now happens is that people are habituated to these apps, right, which have come to shape after insane amounts of iteration, and it's a certain paradigm, right? And what happens is, when somebody is developing in web3, the end user is comparing every single web3 experience with that ultra polished, you know Web 2 experience. And they're almost,
Mm.
I remember one of our advisors at NFT3 is Jesse Liu from you, who was, earlier with Ontology, right? I remember on one of my advisory calls with him, he just goes, the user doesn't care. They don't care what tech stack you've made it with, and what, they're like, it needs to work seamlessly, and it needs to be beautiful and easy to experience. And it's like, and those things take time. There's a lot of finesse, and so yeah, I think somewhere it's a bit unfair on Web3 organizations as well, because not only is there impatience, there's also a very high bar already. And I think it's without a doubt we can say that our DApp layer will have to be, in experiential terms, better than what's out there in the larger world, or we will, have a tough go of it.
I think one of the ways, though, that we're going to persuade consumers that this is a better way is because I think that we have an ability to offer them a very different value proposition.
Right.
And I think about because I can't help but use analogies from gaming, where we spend most of our time. And when you look at the early days of mobile gaming, it was always commonplace for people to compare mobile game experiences to console or PC games. And so much of the game community always said, well, this is crap. Look at how small the screen is. How can you possibly play a game on this screen? There's no joystick. What? I mean, that's not a game. Um,
Right.
and it took a while for game developers to start to refine the products to ways that were conducive to the new medium. So it became that the experience was not to replace a console experience, but to create a new kind of experience. And now, you know 10 years, a decade later, we have people playing first person shooters on mobile and MMOs and stuff, and categories that you never thought would go to mobile. You understood a casual puzzle game, but nobody expected you to play a full on MMO on a mobile platform. But there are advantages to it, and some people use it in addition to their desktop, but it's a new medium. And so I think in Web3, because we have so much value to offer creators and consumers, that value will cause them to, we just have to figure out how to articulate that value proposition to them, and they will come.
I agree with you. That's
Yes, I agree with that too. I think what we as Web3 builders see is the beginning of this 0 to 1 transition in the technology and in the capacity of people to own, to have digital property rights, certainly, but with NFT3 and with our with D data more generally, we really are centered on this idea of data sovereignty, right? Like if we're changing the sort of the basic business dynamics of the internet, it's going to lead to all these really interesting efficiencies. And part of those efficiencies, I think, are delivering more value to that consumer relationship through that P2P orientation, and them having control and ownership over their data, essentially, or their digital property. Um, and those two things have some crossover. So I think that it's an exciting world that we're all kind of co-envisioning, but it's still at the level of um, like an infant trying to take its first steps on the
Yep.
side of the consumer. It's clumsy, right? It's clumsy. It seems a little bit clumsy right now, and it will become. I agree. Like we need to be real about the timescales that are happening here. In terms of software development, but it will become more adroit, right? And that experience itself will be attuned, like you say, just affirming that point, which is a great one, will be attuned to the medium itself, right? And we will have sort of interesting, newer, nuanced experiences that are attuned to that, not attuned to the old model.
Yeah.
Does that jive
Yeah.
and
No,
gel with
I
sort of what you're
absolutely,
saying,
I
or
would
affirm
agree with
what you're
that.
saying, do you think?
I want to drop in another point, if that's okay.
That's
This, because
great.
it's
Yeah.
very interesting, this
Go
this
ahead,
idea
Josh.
of, the medium is the massage.
Of
That's a
course.
big influence for me as well. And I do really appreciate the analogy with games on mobile, right? So let's go back to the tokenization model for a minute, because if we look into it, imagine that the user onboarding experience has been improved a lot. Now suddenly we have incredible firepower in this incentivization model of tokens. One thing I think the current captured by convenience model completely lets go of is treating human beings as intelligent and able to handle their own economics, which is
Mhm.
something I think fundamentally new that we're bringing in, right? With the entire open market of tokens. How do you think that will play in the development not only of the games that are going to be based off of blockchain technology, but in general? Don't you think that that's a nuance of human behavior on an individual level that hasn't really, been given much play so far?
Yes, and I think that that actually, I think that that creates an opportunity for companies to come in and offer services that help to cushion the the drama of this particular element, because I think there are certain ideas, like the idea that I must be responsible for all my own assets, and somebody might steal them from me or hack them or something. There's
Hmm.
fear there, and that's not without reason.
Right.
And because it's a big
Right.
responsibility to go from an environment of relative buffered safety to one where you must be responsible for your own pile of cash, so to speak. And so I think that that actually presents an opportunity for companies to fill that void, whether these are, in Web3 terms, these are custodians, or these are companies that provide transaction insurance, so that, if I make a fat fingered mistake and send my ETH to the wrong address, somebody else will cover that mistake, in the form of some kind of insurance service that I can pay a fee for that service. Because when you think about what we do with physical goods, every time we send 3% of our transaction to Visa, that's the point. It's for that protection. We pay for that.
Right.
And so there's no reason that we
Hmm.
can't have companies providing that, because for me as a consumer, for higher value transactions, I would happily pay for that insurance because it gives me peace of mind as a consumer.
Right. Right. That does make sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I also envision it, I sort of envision it in a similar way where I expect that even in these sort of decentralized systems that are getting built out, where the idea is that there are various smart contract automations or triggers or blah 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 that are, running whatever it is, and there's less and less human interaction, and obviously there's more and more personal responsibility potentially around, the management of your assets, whether they're cryptocurrencies or whether they're NFTs, or whether they're, some in-game item that is, owned by you, rather than owned by the platform. I think, yeah, I think you can sort of work within that time frame where, or work within that frame where, people are offering services to essentially make that process like easier without
Yep.
centralizing it, if that makes sense. So they're guiding, there's a UI UX, there's, whatever it is, and like you say, there's custody already. There are custodies or custodians that are offering those types of services on the asset side of cryptocurrencies. I imagine that there will be in the future sort of, and I'll take this conversation to the future in my follow-up question to this, but I imagine in the future, in this idea of like data sovereignty, or, there won't necessarily be people, individuals interacting like broadly speaking on a P2P basis. If you're selling data, I think there's probably every reason to consider, data trust being developed over time, agglomerations or conglomerations of individuals and entities, working together to sell, access to their metadata in a similar fashion to how it's corralled right now by Google and Amazon, Facebook, blah blah blah, all the FANG companies. Now, I want to know what, I'd really love to know, like from you. And by the way, we take these episodes from about 30 to 45 minutes. It looks like this will go to 45. Just want to temper everyone's expectations on timing. What do you what's the future look like? I'd love to hear what you think are, interesting things from your perspective, and they may have nothing to do with blockchain, but I'm assuming they do, um, that are coming down the line from a technological or global macro perspective, things that you're thinking about right now, things that, you're like, oh, that's really interesting. I know for me, I can open that if we open up this conversation, we might go up over 45 minutes, but Chat GPT is extremely interesting to me. But I'll just cede that,
Sure.
and I'd love to hear what
So
you
I
have to say.
think to broaden that a little bit, I think just AI generally is something that is on a lot of people's minds, not just from ChatGPT, but also from Lens and a lot of the art initiatives, graphical initiatives. And so I think that for us as game developers, the creation of art assets is actually a big part of the cost structure of being a creative industry participant. And so we're thinking a lot about how we can harness these new tools uh, to create content. Because my view is that, you know, the usage of AI to create graphical assets, for example, is not something that's geared towards me cutting cost by replacing staff. It actually just means that 10 artists can hopefully do the job of 100 artists if they have this new super tool available to them. So we can be much more efficient at what we do,
Mhm.
because often when you think about live ops in games, where you create new content for consumers on a regular cadence, that new content creation is largely artwork for most games. That's where a lot of the time is spent in development. And so if we can be more efficient about that as an industry, then we're able to enhance the cadence of content going to consumers. And typically, every time content updates come, those are also revenue events for companies. So it's very good for the efficiency of our industry. So I'm thinking a lot about that. Um, it has it will have huge impacts, ripple effects, not just in our industry, but all over, because related to that, you run into lots of complex issues around the idea of authorship and copyright, and how we will
Hmm.
figure out, solutions to problems that have never really existed before, but
Right.
present interesting questions to us. So I think there's going to be a fair bit of, time spent on that. And as we've seen, the legal and regulatory framework tends to trail this kind of innovation by 5 or 10 years. So it's going to be interesting days ahead.
Let me drop in another question because you mentioned both of you
Yeah,
ChatGPT,
I'm.
right? Uh, it's been interesting because ChatGPT is theoretically GPT 3.5 and actually just has what we could arguably call a UI layer over GPT 3, which has been out for some time now. And obviously, it was making noise even then, but because this will, I think, go back to our conversation about how do we open the floodgates, so to speak, to adoption, right? Because essentially, Chat GPT is a
Mm-hmm.
conversational approach layer over GPT-3. It's not
Hmm.
much more than that. GPT-4 is actually going to be aeons more powerful, but right now that's
Mm-hmm.
pretty much all it
Mm-hmm.
is. But we've seen the order of magnitude of both immersion within the larger public conversation, people attempting it, trying it out, right? What could be a couple of the innovations we could create in our space in Web3 that could potentially just be, those experiential layer switches that suddenly turn a lot more people into it? That's, I think, an interesting question to ask both of you, really.
Can I
Go for it.
answer for
Okay, man.
Robbie? I think he's gonna say. I, I think he's
To a
gonna
certain
say
extent,
games.
yes. So
Am I right?
I think one of the reasons that we started in
Mm,
this area 5 years ago, pivoting to focus on the blockchain side of game development, is because we felt that games were going to be a vector for onboarding users to blockchain, because games are the most popular form of entertainment. Um, I think that what we're going to see in addition to that is we're going to start to see more middleware, because that's one of the things that now, like in the game industry, we have very, very seasoned middleware. So that, you know, if you want to be a game developer at a very basic level, almost anybody can do it, because there are so many out of the box tools
right.
available to create simple games, simple mobile games. You know, a AAA game is a different thing. But if you want to create a simple puzzle game, there are tools available online that even, a non-programmer can do. And I think that what we're going to end up with on top of our infrastructure in Web3 is, there are companies working on this kind of infrastructure, this kind of middleware layer where you can translate things, for example, game developers make in game engines like Unity or Unreal, that this content can then be, capable of accepting tokens and having this kind of user onboarding to wallets and stuff like that built into the workflow of what game developers already do. And that will open up the floodgates, because then you don't have to actually hire, smart contract engineers at every game developer, because that's unrealistic.
I can now answer for Dylan, funnily enough. No.
You know, it's it's
He's
very,
going to say that,
yeah,
well,
you
the
know where
data
I'm
is
going.
essentially a middleware
But
stack.
we're trying to work on that actually, right now. But yeah, I mean, for if you I think you posed that question to me too, Sheshwa, and I agree with obviously I agree with the middleware, the notion of middleware being important now in terms of popularizing the ability of anybody to start integrating aspects of Web3 into whatever application layer they're thinking of. So we've envisioned it, with sort of the broad D data narrative of like I look at companies like Alchemy, which I think is they're awesome, and I think they're sort of really working well on things like this middleware narrative. I liken what companies like Alchemy are working on, even to some extent, like you could argue maybe Polygon. Is it's sort of like first wave Web3 enablement, where you're talking about NFT creation and minting, white labeling, wallets or wallet integrations. We're looking ahead with DData to thinking about what we sort of call like second wave Web3 enablements, which have a lot to do with data sovereignty, things like digital property rights. How are we going to operationalize those things, make it easy for companies to, for example, integrate a decentralized identity protocol into their sign-in process for their customers when the day inevitably comes that their customers are asking them, how do I leverage my Web3 identity through your whatever, through your platform or through whatever service that you're offering, right? I think those are going to be important questions to be answered over the next few years. And so certainly middleware is a huge part of that picture. Um, I think that the other thing that's worthy to consider too is the extent to which, similar to like DeFi Summer, there's going to be some interesting permutation of value going back to a
Hmm.
consumer in a really interesting way that it never has before. And so, whether that's in a gamified context where they're able to, and we saw sort of, initial baby steps of that with, I think with, to some extent with like sandbox and metaversal real estate and stuff like that. But I think it's really going to find its footing over the next couple of years when we're talking about consumers being parts of P2P decentralized, types of networks of various kinds, where they're starting to figure out, well, if I do this, if I go onto Brave, right, as a browser, or I, play this game instead of that game, I'm bound to have a more value in some way, shape, or form, whether that's direct value like monetary value, or whether they're able to leverage something else or get some other benefit than I would in the sort of like
Yeah.
traditional or Web2 context. Those would be, I think that once those sorts of stories start coming out in the media, or they're discussed among friends, and they're like, "Yo, I decided to like use Brave this year instead, and like I made $50." I don't know what it'll be, in terms of, because they have sort of like a
Mm.
remuneration process through using their browser, and we're just going to see that sort of like iterated, refined, nuanced, and writ
Like a
larger and larger
Yes.
personal
in
data
scale.
monetization
That's what
summer.
I think.
Well, and I think
Yeah, personal. Yeah, we'll
I,
have
I
to think
think
of a
also
better
one of the ways
catchphrase than
that
that. But
this is
yes,
going to find more traction amongst consumers is if we think like there's always been a lot of focus in the Web3 community about um, rewarding people for their time. And I think that actually sometimes, because people are so accustomed to being exploited for their time and their data, um, that actually we can try to think about how to reward them in different ways, because actually just rewarding them with cash, so to speak, almost seems too alien to them. So if you imagine people using Brave, and some people
Hmm.
might,
Hmm.
it might resonate that they make $50 a week, but or a month rather, for using Brave, but it may actually be more effective to say, well, if you use Brave, then here's your password for your Netflix subscription, which you get free of charge, right? Or something like that, where the exchange of value is
Yeah.
positioned in a
Yeah.
different
Yeah. Yeah.
way that makes it feel more understandable, because the idea of getting rewarded for your data is so foreign to people. Do you know what I mean?
Wow. Yeah, that's so. You know what that reminds me of? It's like that thing
Hmm.
of,
Hmm.
apparently Steve Jobs had the iPhone already in mind, but he first goes and makes the iPod, and it's like that stepwise kind of walking people
Yes.
through the creative breakthrough. That's remarkable, man.
Hmm.
That's wow. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good point.
Time to.
Gentlemen, I want to remind ourselves. I actually I really want to talk further, but for the
Mm,
consistency of the podcast, I think we need to keep it to a certain time frame. As much I because I there's some other things I'd love to discuss, but why don't we leave them for a
mm.
follow-up
Yeah,
conversation
that
in
sounds
Absolutely.
maybe
good.
a couple months if
You've got
everyone
to have a
agrees.
cliffhanger.
Okay,
One more
cool.
bit about the cliffhanger side of it, actually,
Yeah,
Robbie.
you gotta have a
So I'll
cliffhanger.
introduce you to this. But we have something of a common thing as well that we do in every episode, is we try and end it with a quote. And mostly Dylan and I supply them, But this time I figured, let's
Oh yeah.
anything's fine, anything's game. Top of mind, one of your favorite quotes. We're gonna put it out on a poster. So this is Robbie Young's favorite quote.
Or yeah, what was the last quote that we had? I think we
It
did. It
was,
was the
I
quote
remember
about the
what it was.
house and the
Trevor was
furniture,
giving
wasn't
bear
it? With
market
Trevor?
advice, saying just
Something
live
along those.
through the
Yeah,
hangover. That's what he was saying. Yeah.
yeah. Just live
So
through the
any quote is fine.
hangover. Um, we're talking about, but we like to have this quote as sort of a coalescence of the discussion, right? So, or a distillation rather. So, yeah, maybe take a moment if there's anything. For me, I'm thinking about the theme that we've been discussing about consumer orientation being this really important theme, and maybe there's
Well,
something.
here I
It
can.
doesn't have to be a
I-
masterpiece,
I'll
but
I'll
maybe
give you
just
one
a
which I
thought you
take
can
zero
leave us
credit
with.
for, because I will quote the original statement, but I think it's very appropriate for Web3, and it's something that we at Animoca Brands, requote very often, because we feel like it's kind of fundamental to what we're working on. And the quote is that freedom and property rights are inseparable. You can't have one without the other. Um, and that was an American guy named George Washington.
Mm.
That's a. Can I just say that's a banger? That's. Yeah, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
I've
think
heard
so
of him.
too.
I've heard of
I
him.
think
I
he
feel
wrote a
like I've
white
heard of
paper. I'm
him.
not sure.
I think he has
Anyhow,
a
thank you so
podcast.
much for joining us for this, everyone, as well as Robbie and
Anyway,
Dylan.
it's
I
been
think
great,
this has
man.
been remarkable.
Yeah.
I think I will personally be replaying this, and I think I learned a lot
Pleasure,
from this. So
pleasure.
thanks so much for coming, Robbie, and hope to do this
No
again
problem.
soon.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Robbie.
Cheers.
Awesome. Thanks again.